They branded her irrelevant before hearing a single demand. An older black woman, patient eyes hiding storms they couldn't forecast. Their words dripped with courtesy sharp enough to cut, each rule enforced like a gate slammed in her face without ever admitting it was there. Laughter bubbled behind closed doors, confident they'd put her in her place, certain she'd stay silent and small. But they mistook restraint for weakness. They never considered she might hold the trigger to their unraveling, that her signature alone could erase the ground they stood on. This isn't the narrative they built for themselves, the respectable institution with a polished image. It's the truth they tried to bury. If you're ready to watch what happens when contempt bankrupts itself, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Let's see who saw the ending coming. Mabel Garrison pressed her gloved hand against the cool brass handle and pushed open the glass door of the Bank of Independence, feeling the crisp winter air vanish behind her as she stepped into the grand lobby. Polished marble stretched beneath her feet, reflecting chandeliers overhead. The reception desk gleamed with sterile professionalism, manned by a young woman with an immaculate blonde ponytail who didn't bother to look up immediately. Mabel adjusted her navy wool coat, the one she'd had carefully dry cleaned for the occasion, and held her leather portfolio securely against her side. She'd taken pains to prepare every page of her proposal, every calculation and legal letter neatly tabbed. She approached the desk, offering her warmest smile. "Good morning, dear," she began, her voice calm and measured. "I'm here for my 10 o'clock with Mr. Voss." She raised the portfolio slightly, a signal of her purpose. The receptionist's eyes lifted at last, sweeping over Mabel with a blank, faintly dismissive stare before landing back on the monitor. "I think you might have the wrong location, ma'am," she said after a beat, voice sugar-coated but hollow. "Personal banking is across the street." Mabel's smile wavered, but she held it in place. She had endured far worse insults in her 72 years. "No, I believe I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied softly. "I have a confirmed appointment with Mr. Voss. Yesterday afternoon, he told me to bring these documents." She tapped the portfolio gently on the counter. The receptionist blinked and sniffed as if something unpleasant was under her nose. "Sure, I'll check," she sighed, typing with deliberate slowness, the keys clicking one by one like dripping water in an empty room. After a long silence, she exhaled loudly and gestured with her chin. "Take a seat. He's in another meeting." Mabel's lips pressed together. She turned slowly and surveyed the seating area, noting the sharp lines of designer chairs and modern art that did little to hide the coldness of the space. She selected a chair in the corner and sat carefully, mindful of her aching hip. She rested the portfolio on her lap and folded her hands atop it. Time crawled. She watched the receptionist light up at the approach of a young man in a tailored gray suit. "Good morning, Mr. Davis. He's expecting you. Right this way." The man barely paused before striding through the frosted glass doors at the back. Another woman with a sleek briefcase arrived 15 minutes later, greeted warmly and ushered in without hesitation. Mabel checked her watch. 10:40. She shifted, feeling the persistent twinge of sciatica in her side, but refused to let it show. She glanced at the receptionist, who pretended to type while casting sly, indifferent looks her way. At 11 o'clock, a balding executive in an expensive overcoat breezed in, was greeted with a handshake, and was led to the back instantly. Mabel's chest tightened. She felt the humiliation blooming hot beneath her collar. She adjusted her coat, her fingers trembling for an instant before she forced them steady. She remembered her late husband's words, "Never let them see you lose your composure." She wasn't about to start now. She studied the portfolio in her lap, its embossed gold letters reading Community Prosperity Investment Proposal. Inside were dozens of pages detailing plans for affordable housing, green infrastructure, local hiring programs, a vision to transform neighborhoods, fully backed with $3.2 billion in institutional capital. It wasn't charity. It was business. Serious business. The bank needed that money more than she needed their approval. But no one here seemed to know or care. She could feel the security guard's gaze lingering on her, assessing, judging, dismissing. At 11:15, the receptionist finally called. not looking at her. Clayton Voss sat at the head of the table, his suit a stiff navy with sharp creases, his hair oiled neatly into place. He didn't stand to greet her. Instead, he looked her over with a slow, deliberate scrutiny, his eyes narrowing as though he were inspecting damaged goods. She clutched her portfolio tighter. He finally gave her a thin, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes and gestured vaguely toward the chair opposite him. "Mrs. Garrison, right? Go ahead and have a seat." Mabel obeyed carefully, lowering herself onto the chair with a soft grunt as her knees protested. She smoothed her skirt and set her portfolio squarely on the table, aligning it with the edge. She looked him in the eye with the calm steadiness she'd cultivated over a lifetime. Clayton leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers over his stomach. "So, I understand you're here to discuss some sort of business plan." The words oozed with false courtesy. Mabel opened the portfolio and turned it toward him, revealing pages of carefully organized charts, signed commitments, and analysis from reputable firms. "Yes, sir. This is a proposal for a structured investment totaling $3.2 billion. My firm has worked with several community banks on similar projects. We're looking to establish an anchor partnership with your institution, with all the due diligence completed." She spoke with the confidence of someone who'd given this pitch before, who'd run the numbers more times than she could count. Clayton's eyebrows lifted so slightly it was barely perceptible. He didn't even glance at the documents. Instead, he cocked his head, smiling wider, revealing teeth that seemed to have been whitened for effect. $3.2 billion, you say? That's quite a number. That's ambitious." He tapped a finger slowly on the table, letting the pause hang heavy. "Mrs. Garrison, do you have someone helping you with this paperwork? A son? Or perhaps a lawyer who can explain it all to you?" His tone dripped patronization, each word enunciated as if she might be hard of hearing or slow of thought. Mabel felt the burn in her cheeks, but she refused to look away. "No," she said quietly but firmly. "I'm the managing partner at my firm. I prepared this proposal myself." Clayton's smile didn't fade, but it hardened somehow, curdled at the edges. "Ah, well, that's very impressive." He dragged out the last word as if he were humoring a child showing off a finger painting. He reached for the top page of the proposal with exaggerated care, pinching it between two fingers like it might stain him. He flipped it over without reading it and set it back down. "I just want to make sure you really understand what you're asking for," he continued, voice smooth and low. "Sometimes these financial concepts can be complex, even for seasoned professionals." He leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially, as though sharing a joke. "It's easy to get overwhelmed by all the zeros." Mabel swallowed hard. She forced herself to keep her voice calm, her hands steady atop the portfolio. "I'm aware of the scale, Mr. Voss. My firm has executed projects of comparable size. That's why I'm here today." Clayton let out a short, sharp laugh that wasn't amused. He tapped the table twice and turned to the frosted glass door behind him. "Why don't we bring someone in to help us out?" He didn't wait for her answer. He stood abruptly and opened the door. "Hannah, could you come in here for a second?" A young banker in her 20s hurried in, clutching an iPad and looking bewildered. "This is Mrs. Garrison," Clayton announced cheerfully. "She's here to discuss an investment plan. I thought you might help walk her through some of the trickier parts. Make sure she doesn't get lost in the weeds." The girl blinked, glanced at Mabel and blushed, clearly mortified but too junior to protest. Mabel's heart thudded in her chest. She kept her face carefully still even as shame pooled in her stomach like lead. She had given speeches to city councils, closed deals with federal agencies, advised foundations with assets in the billions. But here she was being explained to, as if she were an addled old woman with no business sense. Clayton settled back into his chair, looking satisfied, crossing one ankle over his knee. "Now then," he said brightly, "why don't you tell Hannah here what you're trying to do, and she can make sure you're all squared away." He clasped his hands, waiting. Mabel's mouth was dry. She glanced at the young banker, who couldn't meet her eyes. Mabel sat frozen for a moment after explaining her plan in front of Hannah, who dutifully nodded while shooting uncertain glances at Clayton. Clayton's grin widened in triumph, sensing Mabel's discomfort but refusing to grant her any real acknowledgement as a professional. He drummed his fingers on the table and declared with mock cheer, "Why don't we take us out front, Mrs. Garrison? Transparency is key here. We don't want any misunderstandings about expectations." He didn't wait for her answer. He stood and gestured toward the glass door, practically herding both her and the bewildered junior banker out of his office like cattle. Mabel rose slowly, her body protesting, heart beating hard in her chest, her mind screaming at her to turn and leave while she still had dignity left. But she had learned long ago that dignity wasn't about walking away. It was about standing your ground even when they tried to strip it from you. So she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and followed him into the main area. The open floor plan was intentionally modern, with clusters of desks surrounded by low glass partitions. Staff looked up as Clayton approached with the older black woman at his side, their expressions ranging from open curiosity to thinly veiled disdain. Clayton made a show of clearing space on the nearest counter, his voice booming. "Everyone, give us a little room. Mrs. Garrison here has quite the proposal to share." His tone was playful but razor-sharp, the kind of sarcasm that needed no translation. Mabel laid her portfolio down with trembling fingers, watching the pages fan out neatly, the gold letters catching the light in a last defiant gleam. She met his gaze with quiet fury, but he only smiled wider. He plucked the first page off the top and held up like an exhibit in court. $3.2 billion, he read slowly, drawing laughter from a couple of nearby staff who tried and failed to hide it. "Wow, that's ambitious, don't you think?" He turned theatrically toward Hannah, who blushed scarlet and looked at her shoes. "Tell me, Hannah, how many zeros is that again?" The young banker stammered, "9, sir," barely audible, but it drew a few more chuckles. Clayton winked at her like a complicit uncle sharing an inside joke. "Good girl. You got to keep these things straight when you're dealing with big numbers." He stretched the words out so Mabel wouldn't miss the insult. Mabel's throat tightened painfully. She pressed her lips together to keep them from trembling. She forced her voice to come out even. "I understand the amount is significant, Mr. Voss. That's why I've prepared a detailed plan, complete with letters of commitment and projected returns." I'd be happy to explain, but Clayton cut her off with a bark of laughter that echoed in the open space. "Explain? Oh, please, don't trouble yourself. I'm sure we'd love to hear how you plan to drop $1 billion or $2 billion into our humble little bank. Maybe buy a couple of fancy condos while you're at it." A wave of cruel snickering rippled through the office. Staff who weren't laughing outright were smirking behind their monitors or whispering to one another. Mabel felt heat rise in her face, her ears burning. She swallowed it down. She would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. She tried again, her voice cracking only slightly. "I have documentation from our partners. I can demonstrate the collateral structure." She opened the folder and pointed to the pages, her hand trembling only a little now, but enough that Clayton noticed and snorted derisively. "Oh, I'm sure you have something," he said mock-sweetly, "but it's important to understand this is a real financial institution. We can't just hand out blank checks because someone comes in with a story and some printouts from Kinko's." The words landed like slaps. The group laughed again, louder this time. A teller near the end of the counter actually doubled over, hand covering his mouth, shoulders shaking. Mabel's vision blurred for a second, but she blinked rapidly until it cleared. She had spent years fighting for opportunities in boardrooms, council meetings, and investor calls. She had stood her ground before men just like Clayton Voss, and she would do it now. She cleared her throat and started to speak, but he held up a finger to silence her like a scolding teacher. No, Mrs. Garrison, please. Don't strain yourself. Let's be honest here," he said, voice dropping to a cruel hush. "This is obviously not going to happen. Not here." He waved the proposal mockingly in front of her face, letting the pages flutter. A junior teller watching nearby lifted his phone and took a photo, clearly visible to Mabel despite his attempt to hide it. She watched in numb horror as he tapped the screen a few times, sending it to someone who immediately burst out laughing and showed it to the person next to them. The receptionist at the front desk didn't even pretend to be subtle as she pointed at Mabel's papers on the counter and whispered to a co-worker. Mabel felt her heart thudding painfully, each beat punctuated by humiliation, rage, sorrow. She pressed one palm flat against the marble counter to steady herself. She realized her legs were shaking slightly. Her voice failed her entirely this time. The words stuck behind a thick, aching lump in her throat. Clayton sighed dramatically. "Well, I think we're done here," he said with a shrug, letting the pages drop one by one onto the counter, their careful tabs crumpling. "Feel free to gather your materials on the way out." She tried to swallow past the tightness in her throat, her mouth dry, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might shake the papers in her hands. With a deep breath that rattled in her chest, she squared her shoulders and looked up at Clayton Voss, who was already halfway back to his glass office with an air of smug finality. She refused to let him dismiss her so easily. Raising her voice just enough to carry, though still calm and controlled, she said, "Mr. Voss, I'd like to speak with the regional director. I believe this matter deserves a fair review." Clayton stopped mid-stride, his back tensing as if the words had struck him physically. He turned slowly, his face darkening, the forced grin gone. The staff nearby fell silent, their eyes flicking between them like spectators at a boxing match. He walked back to her with deliberate, measured steps and leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to a threatening hush that still managed to carry. "Mrs. Garrison, you're being difficult. I think it's time you left." Now, Mabel stood her ground, her knees weak but locked in place, her voice wavering just once before she steadied it. "I have a right to request escalation. I am not leaving until I speak with your supervisor." Clayton's lip curled. "You're disrupting business, Mrs. Garrison. You're scaring the staff." He swept an arm theatrically to indicate the office, where several junior bankers looked studiously at their screens, pretending to be busy while eavesdropping shamelessly. Mabel felt her breath hitch at the words, felt the weight of every stereotype, every old accusation that black women were too loud, too angry, too dangerous. She forced herself to stay calm, her voice softer but no less firm. "I am speaking in a normal tone. I have not raised my voice or threatened anyone. I am requesting fair treatment." Clayton's eyes glittered with triumph as he slammed the folder shut with a loud crack that made her jump. "Enough. Security." His shout pierced the tense silence. Two uniformed guards who had been stationed near the entrance began walking briskly toward them, their radios crackling. Mabel's heart sank as she watched them approach, her body rooted in place by a combination of defiance and fear. Clayton straightened and pointed at her with the authority of a plantation overseer, calling for someone to be dragged away. "This customer is being disruptive and refuses to leave. Remove her from the premises immediately." One of the guards, a heavy-set man with a shaved head, stopped in front of Mabel and gestured firmly with his hand. "Ma'am, you need to come with us. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Mabel's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. She could feel tears threatening, blurring the edges of the office, the gleaming floor, the faces that watched with avid curiosity. She forced the words out, quiet but steady. "Please, I just want to speak to someone who can actually review my proposal." Clayton snorted. "You're done wasting our time. Get her out." The guard stepped closer, his hand brushing the papers in her arms. She tried to pull back, but the pages spilled onto the floor in a messy fan, the neatly tabbed sections scattering, pages skidding across the marble. Her heart clenched painfully as she bent to gather them again, but the guard grabbed her arm gently but firmly, pulling her upright. "Let it go, ma'am," he said, voice not unkind but unyielding. "Let's go." The quiet was heavy for a moment before Clayton Voss, adjusting his tie with brisk satisfaction, turned and clapped his hands lightly as if to break the tension. "Well," he drawled, his voice casual and smug, "that was unpleasant but necessary. Let's get back to work, folks." His words signaled permission to breathe again, and the staff relaxed visibly, eyes returning to screens, fingers tapping on keyboards as though nothing had happened. But the buzz of whispers rippled quietly across the floor. Hannah, the young banker who had been forced to stand beside Mabel while she was humiliated, ducked her head and fled toward the break room, her face red. A few others drifted after her on the pretense of grabbing coffee or checking their phones. Inside the small, sterile space, the conversation started in murmurs that soon turned into laughter. "Did you see her face?" one teller said, voice hushed but gleeful, as he leaned against the counter stirring powdered creamer into his coffee. "She really thought she was going to get a loan for billions. Billions." He snorted so hard he nearly choked. Another teller shook her head, pretending mock sympathy. "Honestly, it's sad. Poor thing must be senile." What's next? Someone's grandma wandering in asking for Bitcoin investment advice. She laughed, tipping her head back. The young banker Hannah sat rigid on the edge of a chair, her knuckles white where they gripped her coffee cup. She swallowed hard. "You guys, do you think maybe it was too much? I mean, she was so polite. She wasn't yelling or anything. She was just old. And they dragged her out like..." Her voice faltered as everyone turned to look at her. The first teller rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on. Don't be naive. Clayton was right. You let people like that think they can come in here talking big money, and suddenly they're scamming us for loans they'll never pay back. It's protecting the bank. That's our job." Someone else snickered. "Yeah, and you know how they are about playing the victim. Better to shut it down before it gets messy." Can you imagine if she made a scene in front of customers? The laughter spread again, uncomfortable but insistent. Hannah's mouth opened, but no words came out. She lowered her eyes, the sting of shame hot in her chest. She took a deep breath and said nothing more. Clayton entered the break room without knocking, his presence silencing the chatter for half a second before it picked back up with forced cheer. He leaned against the doorway, sipping from a branded coffee mug. "Everyone good?" he asked lightly, eyebrows raised. "We handled a little excitement this morning, but let's make sure it doesn't throw us off. Remember, this is a professional environment." He said the last part with a pointed glance at Hannah, who nodded mutely. He smirked. She was causing a disruption. Simple as that. We can't let that stand. Customers want to feel safe here. The teller who had mocked Mabel earlier added eagerly, "Yeah, exactly. She was unpredictable. Old ladies can be just as shady. Remember that time that guy pretended he was an investor and tried to cash a fake bond? You can't trust anyone." Clayton gave a small approving chuckle. "Right, that's the spirit. We have a duty to the bank. Don't let anyone guilt you into second-guessing good judgment." He sipped his coffee again, watching them. The unspoken message settled like cold fog. "Don't question me. Don't make trouble." The laughter slowly died out, but the mood remained smug, self-congratulatory. Then a buzz of phones drew attention as the teller who'd taken the photo earlier held up a screen, barely suppressing a grin. "Look at this," he whispered, showing the blurry picture of Mabel's proposal sprawled on the marble floor, the heading still visible even though the pages were bent and crumpled. A cartoon emoji of a clown was pasted over it, along with a caption that read, "Big money moves." Another teller snorted and reached for the phone. "Send it to me." The photos zipped through their group chat, gathering likes and laughing reactions. Someone added a comment. She thought she was Oprah. Another, should have asked for $1 billion and a free toaster. Clayton watched with mild amusement, not joining in directly, but not stopping it either. When Hannah's gaze flicked to his face, silently pleading for a cue to intervene, he shook his head almost imperceptibly. She swallowed and fell silent. They talked about her. Mabel Garrison had become their entertainment. Her ejection, a shared story they traded like a badge of honor for maintaining their so-called standards. When they arrived at a sleek new bar a few blocks from the bank, a place with polished wood, Edison bulbs dangling from blackboards, and craft cocktails with overlong names, the group found a corner booth and slid in with the easy camaraderie of people who had decided they were on the same side of something important. Clayton Voss settled into the middle of the U-shaped seat like a king on a throne, ordering a round of expensive bourbons without asking what anyone else wanted. He raised his glass before it even arrived. "To protecting the integrity of the bank," he said grandly. The others lifted empty hands or half-finished beers, laughing, accepting the cue to fall in line. "Cheers," one muttered, rolling his eyes in fond exasperation at the formality. But he clinked glasses anyway. Clayton took a sip and set his glass down with a decisive thud. He smiled like a man who knew he owned the room. "All right, come on. Someone tell me that wasn't the most ridiculous shit you've ever seen," he said, leaning forward, eyebrows up, inviting the group in like conspirators. A teller barked a laugh. $3 billion? For some housing projects or whatever. She probably doesn't even know what a billion is. Another mimicked, counting on fingers. Wait, is that more than 1,000? I'm so confused." The table howled. Clayton shook his head, his smile turning mean. He drew himself up, rolling his shoulders as he prepared his next performance. "I swear to God, you should have seen her face when I told her to pack it up," he said, then adopted a high, trembling tone meant to mock Mabel's dignified, slightly southern drawl. "Oh, please, Mr. Voss, let me explain my little plan. I've got billions, I promise." The words twisted, dragged out with exaggerated slowness, wrinkling his nose in fake confusion. The table erupted in laughter again, a few of them pounding the table in appreciation. He pressed on, buoyed by their approval. "Honestly, you know what you reminded me of?" he asked, scanning their eager faces. "Those people who email you from Nigeria saying they have a royal inheritance, if you'll just send your bank details." One of the junior bankers choked on his drink, coughing out a laugh. "Jesus, Clayton," he said, eyes watering. But he didn't protest. No one did. Clayton let the laughter subside enough for him to be heard again. "I mean, let's be real," he continued. "I saved us today. Imagine the scandal if we approved anything for her. We'd be the next Fire Festival. She'd be on a yacht with our money while we're explaining to the board why we're bankrupt." He lifted his glass again, inviting the group to toast. "To keeping the bank safe from Grandma Get Rich Quick," he declared. The phrase landed like a slap and an invitation at once, setting off another wave of laughter, harsher now, more confident in its cruelty. Glasses clinked around the table. Some smiled tightly, but joined in anyway, not wanting to be singled out. At the end of the booth, the youngest member of the team, Hannah, pulled out her phone as if to check a message, eyes fixed firmly on the screen to avoid looking at anyone. She recorded a brief clip of the group as they raised their glasses, capturing Clayton's smug grin and the phrase, "Grandma Get Rich Quick," as it fell from his lips. But she didn't say anything. Her coat hung on the back of the chair, still damp from the evening's chill. The crumpled pages of her ruined proposal sat in a stack beside her, flattened out as best she could but scarred with creases, the tabs bent and unreadable in places. She stared at them for a long moment, the pain in her chest blooming hot and heavy. The humiliation replayed itself again and again behind her eyes, the laughter, the looks of condescension, the cruel mimicry of her voice. She heard Clayton's mocking tone like it was playing on a loop, felt again the security guard's grip on her arm as he pulled her away from the scattered remnants of her plan, watched the staff avert their eyes or openly sneer as she was forced out into the cold. She pressed a hand to her sternum, feeling her heart beating like a drum beneath her palm, her breathing ragged for a moment before she forced it steady. She wasn't new to being underestimated. She wasn't new to being disrespected. She had spent a lifetime fighting for respect, for space at the table, for the chance to speak without being spoken over. But something about today cut deeper than usual, maybe because of how carefully she prepared, maybe because she had so hoped it would be different. Maybe because they hadn't even tried to hide it. She swallowed the sour taste of grief that rose in her throat. Then she leaned forward, old joints creaking, and turned on her laptop. The screen's glow illuminated the lines on her face, carved deep over 72 years of refusing to give up. She typed slowly at first, warming her stiff fingers. Then, with growing precision, she opened her email and scrolled through the new messages. A subject line made her freeze. "Customer removed from bank goes viral." She clicked it, her heart clenched as she watched the shaky phone video of herself being pulled out, her voice breaking as she tried to explain, the security guards looming, the pages of her plan littering the floor like trash. The comments below were a mix of sympathy, disbelief, and cruel jokes. She closed the window. She forced herself to breathe again. Next, she opened the internal portal for her investment firm, a site she'd paid to have custom built so she could manage things herself if she needed to. She checked the balances and confirmed what she already knew by heart. $3.2 billion in capital tied up in instruments spread carefully across that bank's accounts, funding planned community initiatives, green housing, education grants, all routed through their institution because they had promised her their support. She tapped her fingers lightly on the keys for a moment. Then she started typing a new email. She addressed it to her firm's board of directors, people who knew her well enough to know she didn't rattle easily. She used no salutation, no flowery greeting, just the words she needed. Effective immediately. I am authorizing full divestment of our capital from Independence Bank. Begin the unwinding process and freeze all new allocations. Notify counterparties as required. Prepare for press inquiries. She read it once. Then she typed another line. Attached is footage of my forced removal from their branch and the discriminatory treatment I received while attempting to conduct legitimate business. She attached the video that had been shared online. She also attached the images she had recovered, screenshots of staff smirking over her crumpled proposal. A tray of untouched coffee sat cooling in the center, forgotten. Clayton Voss sat near the end of the table, jacket wrinkled from a sleepless night, hair flattened where he'd run shaking fingers through it too many times. He kept darting glances at the door as if waiting for someone to burst in and drag him away. He didn't understand why he'd been called in. Not really. Not until now. The CFO stood at the head of the table, pallid and drawn, voice cracking every few words. "We have a serious issue," he said, clearing his throat as if to buy himself time. "As of this morning, Prior Community Partners has fully divested their holdings. All $3.2 billion in capital is gone. Wire transfers processed overnight. Our liquidity position is untenable. Lines of credit frozen. Capital ratios in breach." There was a stunned silence as the words settled like lead. The board chair, a hawk-faced man with silver hair and an impeccable suit, leaned forward slowly, fingers tented in front of him. His voice was ice. "Explain how this happened." The CFO licked dry lips. "We received a notification late last night authorizing the immediate pullout, accompanied by..." He trailed off and gestured to the projector. The screen flickered to life, revealing an email with an ominous subject line in bold black letters. "Your upcoming PR nightmare." The room shifted with unease. Clayton felt sweat gather under his arms, soaking through his crisp white shirt. He tried to swallow, but his throat was too tight. The CFO hit play. The video that appeared was grainy but unmistakable. It showed a small, elderly black woman clutching papers to her chest, her mouth working around words no one listened to as security guards dragged her across the gleaming marble floor. Her face was twisted in confusion and humiliation. The footage continued with snippets from a lobby, the staff whispering, the laughter, the phone camera zooming in on the scattered pages of her proposal. Then it cut to a photo someone had shared privately, now blasted on the big screen for all to see. Mabel's ruined folder labeled Community Prosperity Investment Plan, with clown emojis pasted crudely over it. A collective, horrified breath sucked the air from the room. Clayton shrank in his seat, heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. His mouth fell open slightly as he realized what he was seeing, what he'd done. But it wasn't over. The CFO, face pale as paper, cleared his throat again. "There's more." He tapped a key, and the next video played. It was taken at the bar, taken by Hannah. The camera was a little unsteady, but focused on Clayton at the center of the booth, glass raised high, voice gleeful. "To keeping the bank safe from Grandma, get rich quick," he declared. The video captured the laughter, the cheers, and most damningly, his grotesque imitation of Mabel's soft southern accent, drawn out in a cruel parody that sounded unmistakably racist. Clayton's voice filled the boardroom, mocking, derisive, unmistakable. "Oh, please, Mr. Voss, let me explain my little plan. I've got billions, I promise." The words played twice before the CFO managed to stop it. Silence fell like a heavy door slamming shut. Clayton realized he was shaking visibly. He turned to see the board chair's eyes fixed on him, cold as glass. No one laughed now. No one smirked. No one whispered. The board chair leaned back slowly, exhaling as if it physically hurt. "This is what our partners received," he said softly. News networks ran the same damning clip on a loop. Mabel Garrison, small and dignified even in distress, clutching her portfolio while two security guards led her firmly but inexorably out of the bank lobby. Each broadcast showed the same moment she turned, as if to speak, only to see her papers scattered on the marble floor, her eyes wide with pain, confusion, and something even worse, betrayal. Below the video rolled captions in bold, outraged fonts. "The grandmother who took down a bank. Community leader humiliated by racist staff. $3.2 billion withdrawn in protest." The headlines seemed to multiply hourly. Financial analysts tried to explain the bloodbath as the stock price plunged double digits in real time. Clips of frantic trading floors filled the screen, brokers yelling into phones. The company's logo now a mark of scandal. Pundits debated whether it could survive at all. Local affiliates sent reporters to the flagship branch, filming a growing line of protesters chanting for accountability. They carried hand-painted signs reading "Not one more, banks for all," and "No place for hate." Some held up blown-up stills of Mabel's ejection, while others distributed flyers calling for customers to close their accounts in solidarity. Corporate PR teams scrambled to issue statements, each more panicked than the last. The first was cautious, calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding. The next, hours later, admitted unacceptable conduct. By evening, the CEO himself stood at a podium in front of a bank of microphones, hair disheveled, his expression grim with defeat. Cameras flashed as he read haltingly from prepared remarks, acknowledging systemic problems, apologizing directly to Mabel Garrison by name, and announcing his resignation, effective immediately. Reporters shouted questions over one another. Was this standard practice? Who approved these policies? How many other customers were mistreated? He blinked at the lights, mouth working without sound, then finally stepped away from the microphone and left without taking a single question. Meanwhile, Clayton Voss was having his own reckoning. The board had wasted no time severing ties. Security met him in his office with the same cold professionalism he had once so enjoyed wielding. They let him gather a single cardboard box of personal items while avoiding eye contact. His framed degree, his branded travel mug, a small photo of him on a golf course with regional managers. He dumped them in the box with trembling hands, cheeks flushed red with humiliation. He tried to speak, to explain, to tell them it wasn't his fault, that he was protecting the bank, that she had been unreasonable, but no one was listening. He heard the whisper of "disgusting" behind him from someone he'd once considered an ally. They let him out through the front entrance, not the employee exit, because reporters had gathered there, cameras rolling, microphones thrust forward as soon as they saw him. "Mr. Voss, do you have anything to say about the video? Do you admit to mocking an elderly black woman? Do you think racism has a place in banking?" He blinked in the harsh winter light, mouth opening and closing like a dying fish. Words failed him entirely. His tie was askew, the top button undone, his hair limp with sweat. The security guard at his side cleared his throat and gently nudged him forward. "Keep moving, sir." Clayton stumbled down the steps, cameras following every uneven stride, the shouting questions now joined by boos from protesters who had gathered across the street. One woman screamed, shame, at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with rage. Another hurled a crumpled flyer at his feet. He didn't look back. Inside the bank, shell-shocked employees watched the live feed on their phones, the lobby silent except for the anchor's voice describing the dramatic public firing and the ongoing investigation into discriminatory lending. HR called emergency meetings, instructing staff to cooperate with the federal regulators, now confirmed to be reviewing the bank's practices. Branch managers received curt directives to gather all training records, security footage, and email logs. Some employees tried to scrub their social media accounts of the mocking posts from the day before, but journalists had already collected screenshots. The bank's general counsel issued a memo in all caps, "Preserve everything." And miles away, In a modest, warm-lit house with creaking floors and photos of grandchildren on every wall, Mabel Garrison sat at her kitchen table, the same battered leather portfolio in front of her. She had watched it all unfold on her old TV, the volume low so it wouldn't drown out the ticking clock or the hum of the heater. A year had passed, but the memory of what happened at Independence Bank had not faded. In fact, it had become something of a cautionary tale, a case study taught in ethics seminars, dissected in financial oversight committees, and whispered about in boardrooms where executives suddenly found themselves a little less certain of their immunity to consequences. The building itself had undergone a transformation. Gone was the sterile, intimidating marble that had seemed designed to make anyone who wasn't already rich feel small. It had been redesigned with warm wood panels, broad windows that let in light instead of reflecting it back, and a lobby that featured artwork from local community painters. The signage had changed too, rebranded under new leadership that had been brought in after the old CEO's hasty, televised resignation. A plaque now stood near the entrance, etched with an official apology and a commitment to fair lending practices. It was written in plain language, no legalese, no fine print, because the new board chair insisted it had to be understood by everyone who walked through the door. The staff had changed as well. Some had left in disgrace or quit under the pressure of public scrutiny. Others had been retrained, forced to sit through mandatory sessions on bias and discrimination that went far beyond ticking boxes. The bank had created a community advisory board made up of local leaders, nonprofit directors, and small business owners. And on that board sat Mabel Garrison. She hadn't wanted the role at first. She was tired, truth be told. Tired of fighting so hard just to be heard. But when they asked her to help rebuild the place she had so publicly humiliated, she had taken a long, quiet walk through her neighborhood before deciding. She remembered what her father used to say when she was a girl, watching him fix other people's broken fences and mend their roofs for free if they couldn't pay. If it's broken, baby girl, you can't just leave it. You have to help fix it, even if you didn't break it. So she said yes, not for the bank, but for the people who still needed it. The new lending initiative was her brainchild, funded by the capital she'd withdrawn and reinvested in local credit unions and small community banks. It focused on providing financial education and fair credit to people who had been systematically shut out. Minority-owned small businesses, seniors trying to protect what little retirement they had, young families buying their first homes. The flagship branch had converted a corner of its once ornate lobby into a bright, welcoming community room. That day, a class was in session. Folding chairs were set up in neat rows. A whiteboard on wheels had bullet points scrawled in green marker. Credit scores, predatory lending, budgeting 101. At the front of the room stood Clayton Voss. He wore khakis and a modest button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. He had lost weight over the year, the stress showing in new lines around his eyes. He didn't try to hide it. When he spoke, his voice had lost its commanding sneer. It was quieter, rougher around the edges. He didn't posture. He didn't dominate the room. He explained terms carefully. He asked questions and waited for real answers. He told the truth about how banks really worked, including the ugly parts. It was part of the settlement agreement that he volunteer for the program he had once dismissed as unnecessary. But he wasn't just serving out time. Not anymore. As Mabel sat in the back row, she watched him with a critical eye, ready to see the old arrogance flare up. But he stayed humble. When an older man raised his hand to ask if banks could legally move his money without permission, Clayton didn't mock him. He didn't condescend. He said softly, they shouldn't, ever. And if anyone tries to tell you different, you come here. We'll help you. He caught Mabel's gaze at that moment, just briefly, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness, exactly. Something harder. Understanding. When the session ended, people gathered their notes and shook Clayton's hand. He smiled, but there was no triumph in it, just tired gratitude. Mabel waited until the room emptied out. Then she walked slowly to the front, her sensible shoes squeaking once on the polished floor. Clayton straightened as she approached, setting the dry erase marker down carefully. He wiped his palms on his pants, visibly nervous. "Mrs. Garrison," he began, voice cracking. She held up a hand. "Mabel," she corrected. He nodded quickly. "Mabel," he said, voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him for a long moment, the silence settling heavy between them, filled with all the things that had been said and done. She let him feel it. Then she extended her hand. He blinked at it, surprise softening the lines of his face. Slowly he took it. Her grip was firm despite the arthritis in her fingers. "Let's make sure no one else is treated like that again," she said quietly. His eyes shone, but he blinked the tears back. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I will." She released his hand and turned to leave, pausing at the doorway to glance back once. She saw him standing there, smaller than he'd ever seemed, but somehow more human. Outside, the winter sun poured through the big new windows, illuminating the words on the plaque for everyone to see. She read them once more before pushing the door open and stepping out into the cold, her breath curling before her like smoke. She felt the weight of the past year settle on her shoulders, but she also felt something lighter, something like hope. Because justice wasn't revenge. Justice was making sure the harm stopped. Justice was making sure it didn't happen again. The end. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to like it and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd really love to know what you think about the plot. Did the ending resonate with you? What was the most powerful moment for you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Also, let me know where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. Let's talk about it below.